Sit gloria Domini in secula lectabitur Dominus in operibus suis. Rex celi Domine maris undisoni, Titanis mitidis qualidique soni, Te umiles favori modulis venerando finis, se juveos plagitant variis liberale maris.
Nobilis, humilis, magne martir stabilis, habilis, utilis, comes venerabilis, et tutor laudabilis tuos subditos, serva carnis fragilis, mole positos.
Hi, my name is Stan Brakhage, and I've very kindly been asked by Len Barron, first of all, to try to make a weekly radio program to share some of my thoughts about the arts, and most especially to share with you some of the recordings of poets, of music, some of the plays and dramas that I've collected over the years, things that are very, very special to me and that I'd like to be able to give somehow to people at large. What we heard at the beginning, which will be the introduction music for this program from now on, is Gregorian Chant, specifically some parallel organums. They're directed by Dennis Stevens, and they're part of a Musical Heritage Society series called The History of European Music, Volume 2. And like a great deal of what I'll be playing on this program, they're out of print and obscure to begin with, not well known. They were recorded by the Accademia Monteverdiana, Holy Trinity Church, London. And what they essentially represent to me are a high point for me personally of music from the 5th through the 13th centuries. I want to lay emphasis on the word personal. I have to be free in doing this kind of program to be nothing but personal, which is to say sometimes, often, maybe always, a fool in a way. I'll mispronounce things and falter now and again, and my knowledge is one that is amateur in that sense of lover. And maybe I have stature in the world more specifically in relationship to film, but otherwise film doesn't represent itself very well on the air, and the best you'll have of that is opinions from time to time. For instance, I want to encourage film that's as out of the mainstream as some of the music and some of the poetry that I'll be presenting. And most specifically, would like to encourage people to go to the first-person cinema, which is every Monday night at 8 o'clock in the Fine Arts Building at the University of Colorado, where you'll be able to see a variety of films made most individually in the one sense, but in the other, to me, though that's hard to prove, as an attempt to make an art. An art of film is kind of an absurdity in itself, because film really is less than 100 years old. And I'd say among the many definitions of art that I'll give on this program, one that's the most cautionary is that we really don't know what an art is till it's been around maybe at least 100 years, and the people who've made it are long dead. The opening piece of music, we don't even know who wrote that music. We know it is only as part of the great history of church music. And while that's still in your ears and still in mind, I'd like to share with you a piece of music that was sent to me last week by a filmmaker whose works are often shown on the Monday evening series, Andrew Noren. Andrew recorded, just carrying his little pocket recorder with him, performances of Theodorus Kekkes, who was flown over from Athens by the Bohemian Gardens in Astoria, Queens, and who made this beautiful music on pipes with a goatskin bag under the arm, and one of the most ancient forms of music. And of course, Kekkes is a modern living man, but this music and this way of making music, which is inspired, I think, as you'll immediately hear, bagpipes on the one hand, or, and here I reach for a point, the Gregorian Chant on another. What you're hearing is just a live performance with lots of talk and dancing in the background, and even the subways coming in like great monstrous beasts at times. And here it is. This is a music which in its origin began with just the two pipes. The goatskin bag is attached sometime later, we don't really know when, as an additional breath bag to provide the bass drone to the music. And it's far more ancient than it was in the Greeks, actually. Even what we call the pipes of Pan, which is a set of pipes of different lengths that are blown into at the top, like kids blow into pop bottles these days for making that kind of sound. Even that form was really first referred to in poetry in 1150 BC Chinese. This ancient music, in other words, goes back to the earliest folk stories of Melanesia, for example. The wind blowing through a crack in wood and humans picking that up and supplying each his and her own breath. It was a time when the first great movie that's still going was watched, an extreme slow-motion movie that is the watching of the sky itself across centuries, the information of the shift and change of the stars passed on from generation to generation. As people watched those skies with that infinite patience of those times, they saw shapes in them, and the very first heroic figures and stories, motion picture stories, so to speak, took place in my sense of it. That which gives me the greatest sense of passage of time and of the human endeavor is Rimbaud's first Illumination. It's called After the Flood. I'm going to read you from the Wallace Fowley translation, Illuminations, After the Flood, Arthur Rimbaud, French poet. As soon as the idea of the flood had subsided, a hare stopped in the clover and the swinging flower bells and said its prayer through the spider's web to the rainbow. The precious stones were hiding, and already the flowers were beginning to look up. The butcher's blocks rose in the dirty main street, and boats were hauled down to the sea, piled high as in pictures. Blood flowed in Bluebeard's house. In the slaughterhouses, in the circuses where the seal of God whitened the windows, blood and milk flowed. Beavers set about building. Coffee urns let out smoke in the bars. In the large house with windows still wet, children in mourning looked at exciting pictures. A door slammed. On the village square, the child swung his arms round and was understood by the weather vanes and the steeple cocks everywhere under the pelting rain. Madame X installed a piano in the Alps. Mass and the first communions were celebrated at the 100,000 altars of the cathedral. The caravans departed, and the Hotel Splendide was built in the chaos of ice and polar night. Since then, the moon has heard jackals yelping in time deserts and ecologues in wooden shoes growling in the orchard. Finally, in the violet budding grove, Eucharist told me spring was here. Gush forth waters of the pond, foam, pour over the bridge and over the woods. Black shrouds and organs, lightning and thunder rise up and spread everywhere. Waters and sorrows, waters and sorrows rise up and bring back the floods. For ever since they have gone, oh, the precious stones buried and the opened flowers. We have been bored. The queen, the witch lighting her coal in the earthen pot, will never tell us what she knows, and what we shall never know. Of course, that's not read to you as a poem, really, because poetry can't be translated. But as in the case with reproductions of paintings, there's something that always translates. So I use it, as people do most often, and one might almost say only, with poetry from other languages, as a kind of distant illustration of something that came to the poet, as I sense it, while he was moving among the magic of sounds that could only exist in his language. At least that's my sense of it. I'd like now to play you a piece of music by Carl Ruggles. This is from an album still in print, a Columbia Records album, but I don't ever hear Ruggles' music being played. It was so remarkable to me finally that all his life's work was published after his death, and he lived to be very old. He died at 95. I knew him personally when he was in his young 70s and 80s. And always the dream was then that someday somebody would publish his works, which shouldn't have been too much of a problem, as his entire constant, steady life's output can be put on 2 LP records. The piece I've chosen to play for you is written in memory of his wife Charlotte, whom I certainly remember deeply also. She died in 1957. He based his his final piece of music to her and worked on it across most of the rest of his life. It's based on a hymn, O God, Our Help in Ages Past, and the piece is called Exaltation. Exaltation by American composer Carl Ruggles. Exaltation for brass, chorus, and organ. And it's played by the brass ensemble, Gerard Schwartz, and the Greg Smith chorus. And I just want to take a few moments to reminisce about Carl Ruggles. When I knew him, it was when he and his wife Charlotte were living in Bennington, Vermont, not too many years before her death in the early 60s. They lived in an old church which had been abandoned and was going to ruin, and they'd managed to buy it and remake it into a house, but it was more of a church than I think any other church was at that time to me, as they made it their domestic living quarters. They were not quiet and peaceful old people. I think the story I like best about Carl Ruggles is once the harpsichordist Kirkpatrick visited him and was kept waiting while Ruggles was pounding over and over again the same chord on a piano. And finally, even Kirkpatrick's patience ran out, and he cleared his throat and said, "Why are you pounding that chord over and over again on the piano?" And Carl Ruggles, without breaking a beat, pounded again and said, "I'm giving it the test of time." And that's the way he wrote all his music, and that's why there's so little of it, and that's why it's also so great. I don't think we have anything to compare to it. Even Anton Webern looks like a very prolific composer in comparison to Carl. He also composed his music out of small domestic household things, like he had a little one of those Christmas 3 angels, brass angels with trumpets that are turned by candles underneath them, the heat making them spin constantly and tinkle against bells. For a large portion of his life, he wrote 2 versions of a piece called Angels that's based on this kind of source of inspiration. He was typically American and unhappily, sadly ignored by his culture across most of his lifetime. But as you heard in this piece that I played, I hope, he incorporated all of everything of the past and made his slight variations and made them constantly throughout the piece, so that there's no 2 lines that really are at all sounded the same. Mainly, he loved to make music where the actual notes that were played were secondary to the overtones that they would produce. And in that sense, he was one of the most modern composers living in this century, and perhaps the closest composer friend to Charles Ives. Ives I'll also have some stories about, though I never met him. I do remember hearing as a child that extraordinary performance of his symphony on the air, which startled a nation that was thinking of Shostakovich as the most modern at that time. So I want to end this program and all my programs on a brief poem, you'd really have to call it, piece of music by Charles Ives called The Seer.